welcome. Today's a very special day. We have one of our very own experts here with us to talk about the women's suffrage. And it's an exciting year for that for many reasons. But before I do, please tell me a little bit about who you are and why you're here.
My name is Jessica Brannon-Wranosky. I'm a professor in the Department of History. My title at the university is Distinguished Professor of Digital Humanities and History. And one of the areas of specialization, the things I focused on for the last almost 20 years now, is the movement that provided women with the right to vote and also with voting rights in general. So this year is the 100th anniversary of the United States Constitution's 19th Amendment, and there's been a lot of commemoration and a lot of focus put on this, and I'm really excited to talk to you about it today.
Thank you, Jessica. So 20 years, you've been working on this topic for 20 years.
Almost 20 years.
Are you ready for the centennial to be over?
Yes. A little
Okay.
bit, no. I'm really excited to see the stuff that's coming out of it right now. And I'm really excited to see the attention that's been put on it, because more people are getting involved, and more not only academic historians, but just history enthusiasts are getting involved, and public history, I would say history buffs, right, are getting involved and really wanting to know more and stretching where the research has been in the past. So in a way, it's a lot going on, but at the same time, it's really exciting to see people so focused.
It is very exciting to see the enthusiasm come out of people for this topic. I myself am a woman and I do vote. However, I have not spent 20 years studying the history. So consolidate everything you know that I need to know, and maybe some of our alumni out there are watching. What are the highlights? What do we need to know about this important milestone?
Well, first of all, I loved what you just said, that it's a milestone. That a lot of the time when historians have talked about the 19th Amendment and when it was passed into law in August of 1920, we often talk about it as this huge end to something, as if all women in 1920 gained the right to vote, which is not what happened at all. But it was like you said, a milestone. It's the middle. It's not a beginning. It's not an end. It's a continuation in a lot of ways. And where we sit in 2020 right now, in the last few years, I'd say decade or so, but really in the last few years, that's what people are focusing on more. And I'm really glad to see that, because that's where my research and my focus has been the entire time, was to talk about this idea that when we discuss women gaining the right to vote, outside of an academic book or an academic article or for an academic conference, it's been very much about Susan B. Anthony and Susan B. Anthony, and we don't get very much of a larger story, and not everyone can connect to that idea. It's very exclusive. She was Northeastern, she was white, she was upper middle class, and to a large extent lived most of her life in basically urban areas. And that leaves out a lot of people. I mean, let's talk about how that's not really, reflective, for example, of our Northeast Texas area, almost at all.
Let's talk about it, Jessica. Who was left out? You said, you described Susan B. Anthony, but not all women gained that right. So tell me explicitly, who was left out in that movement or at that time? Okay.
Well, Susan B. Anthony's dead by the time the 19th Amendment passes. So she was, no, I'm kidding. I was going to say she was left out. But really what's going on is that there's all sorts of voting Kateri.
Hey!
Zoom just crashed. I thought, all right.
It's the world we live in now. I threatened that I was going to start singing, but I didn't want everyone to leave. They hung in with us. For the record, you don't want to hear me sing. So
I have no idea where we were. Why don't we just start with the next question you want to ask, and I can.
The question you had just started to answer, and I was so excited. I learned that Susan B. Anthony didn't get to vote because she died by that first time. But woman, in addition to her, who was left out, because we talk about women earning the right to vote 100 years ago, but that's not the case.
Right.
So tell me more.
part of what I focused on in my research throughout was both looking at who may not have had complete access to the 19th Amendment in 1920, but was still really interested in the promise of what women's voting could bring. And so even though you see all of these restrictions, and I'm going to name some more again because we had that pause, the intermission that was unplanned, but poll taxes and literacy tests and the Texas white primary and primary elections and violence and intimidation prior to and leading up to the polls and keeping people from being able to get to the polls. But also something a lot of people don't know is it's even though the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, there are a couple of states, including Mississippi, that refused to put it into action. So actually, no women got to vote in those states until 1922 in the midterm elections. And so they were completely convinced that the United States Supreme Court was not going to uphold the constitutional validity or the constitutional nature of the 19th Amendment. And then when the Supreme Court did uphold the 19th Amendment, they went, oh, okay, well, we're going to have to put this in law. And we see a lot of that associated with fear of certain state office holders, that a lot of people that they have tried to keep from voting are going to vote, and they're going to vote them out of office. And that could be rural versus urban voters. That could be labor class, working people voters versus middle class and upper class voters. That could be, but a lot of that, even if those other things were part of it, was also race and ethnicity and immigration nature. And so a lot of other people that didn't get to vote at that point, women that didn't get the right to vote, African-American women, depending on the state, depending on the location, but pretty solidly nationwide in a lot of places for different reasons, depending on what each state had used as restrictions. Mexican-American women, a lot of Mexican-American women didn't get to vote. Immigrant women, American Indian women didn't get to vote until the 20s. Late 20s. And so we see this moment in 1920 that's really important. It really is. And we really, people were very excited to see it happen, but it held just as much promise as it held an immediate opportunity. And so that's part of kind of the difference that we've looked at. That's what my research to some extent has focused on. Zoom is against this today. They've said enough suffrage history.
There's some pranksters. My kids like to play pranks on me all the time. I went away and my daughter swapped my shampoos with yellow food coloring. So Zoom is doing something similar to you today. So my apologies. Okay. So something you said twice in between both intermissions. What is it called when you have the multi-mission? I don't know. You said that women believed in the promise of what could be through women's voting, and that kept them going, even though there were barriers along the way and they weren't able to vote yet. That promise of what could be was there. Tell me about that promise and how that evolved to the later years, the last 20 years, and your research, the part that you're really excited about.
Okay, you're gonna have to ask that again because it froze.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. The promise of what could be.
You there?
I am, but you're frozen.
You there?
I am. Yours keeps freezing up, but we're live the whole time.
I have no idea what's going on. I'm in the middle of suburban Dallas. I've never had this happen.
Does your Wi-Fi look fine? Does your Wi-Fi look fine? Your internet state?
Yeah,
Everything?
everything's fine. I don't know what's going on.
We'll just roll with it.
While you're talking to me, I'm going to see if I can move over to a hotspot, and maybe that'll make it better, but I doubt it. Let's see if I can get that to show up. Anyway, okay.
We'll try.
Just do what we can do.
What I was saying is, you talked about the women being committed to this milestone because they believed in the promise of what could be.
They did. And it's not just women, it's men as well. And I think this is really important. When we talk about women's suffrage, we often talk about only the women that were involved in women gaining the right to vote. But the fact was that almost all legislators at the state level, congresspersons were congressmen, and the vast majority of voters across the United States, even in the states that provided women the right to vote before the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, you add those women voters in, you still have the vast majority of voters across the United States are men, which meant that men had to see, at least a good portion of these groups had to see a promise in women gaining the right to vote. And so I want to add that in too, that part of, the idea was that when women gained the right to vote, it changes the electorate. It changes the kinds of issues that can be talked about and the perspectives. And a lot of those arguments were there. A lot of the arguments that are used at the time and a lot of the campaigning, and a lot of people really invested in it. We're talking about mothers, we're talking about daughters, we're talking about wives and sisters. We're talking about women who may be in the professional world, but are in different placement. But also the fact was that women were adults. They were thinking, functioning adults. And to deny the right to vote to half the population was a real, big conversation about how extreme that was. And so men who were invested in women gaining the right to vote had a lot to gain from it too. Think about the potential of doubling the voting population just overnight. Now, technically, like I said earlier, a whole lot of people aren't being allowed to vote. But if women in different communities are restricted on the voting, probably men in those communities are also restricted in having access to vote. And so you're still doubling the voting population of whoever has access. But beyond all that, a lot of my research is also focused on Texas. And in Texas, you have a lot of this going on where there are women who are leaders within, for example, local branches of the Texas NAACP that are very invested in seeing women gain the right to vote and gain access to the right to vote. The first NAACP branch in the state of Texas was in El Paso. And there's a woman who's I worked a lot. Her name was Maud Sampson at the time that women gained the right to vote. Later in the 1920s, her first husband passes and she remarries and she becomes Maud Williams. And so in my research, I refer to her as Maud Sampson Williams. She's a really good example of this, though. She's a vice president of that local NAACP, which is the first in the state. She's writing to the National American Women's Suffrage Association, was the largest national suffrage association ever, really, in the United States. And she's writing and saying, I have this local club, we would like to affiliate. And they say no. And not only do they say no, they contact Texas suffragists who were, or I should say their Texas suffrage affiliate. And the Texas suffrage affiliate, Texas Equal Suffrage Association, and all of their local affiliates, it's all completely segregated white. And they contact and they say, make it stop. Not only can she not affiliate with us, but she shouldn't really affiliate with you either. It's going to ruin everything. And, we always wondered what happened to her. We could never really find her in the records. And so for years and years, I just kind of checked back with El Paso every once in a while. I'd call the El Paso County Clerk's office and say, hey, have you digitized your records yet? No, ma'am. No, we haven't. And over the years, I knew there was a bigger story there, because that NAACP out of El Paso in 1927 and 1932. So we're talking like she's writing the national Suffrage Association in 1918. So it's not even a decade later. Will successfully argue 2 out of 3 United States Supreme Court cases that will overturn the white primary. And so I was like, that community's not that big. Everybody has to know each other. Well, it turns out she's a vice president in that NAACP. And the reason we lost her is her first husband had passed. It's a thing with women's history. The names change and can change many times over a lifetime. And when El Paso finally digitized their records, I was able to find property records that indicated her first name, her first married name, but also had her second married name, Williams. And the extraordinary thing about that is that we know who Mrs. E.M. Williams is. Mrs. E.M. Williams goes with a young woman named Thelma White in 1954, right after the Brown versus Board Supreme Court case, to ask for, Thelma White was the local valedictorian from the African American high school in El Paso, to ask for her to be registered. And at the time it was Texas Western, now it's UTEP. 1954. So here we have her in 1918, and we still see her really active in 1954, and it totally changes the story, because while NASA's saying, no, not for you. You don't get to be part of this. We're not going to affiliate. She doesn't go away. The group doesn't go away. They continue to be enormously active, and for decades. And that Supreme Court case, that federal court case that comes out of Texas Western is the first out of a federal court other than the United States Supreme Court. So basically, Texas Western is the second university in the state of Texas to desegregate.
Wow.
And you see this, it just changes the narrative so much. It changes the story so much, because you get to see where the suffrage movement goes and where these suffragists continue to be active for decades and decades later. A Northeast Texas story. You want a Northeast Texas story?
I do.
Okay, for just down the road. A woman named Sophia Alice Callahan. She was part Creek, American Indian. And she is the author of a book in the late 1800s called Wynema. It's considered the first novel ever published by an American Indian woman ever in the United States. And in it, she's very pro-suffrage in the 1800s, in the late 1800s. And she passes away decades before women gained the right to vote. She was very young when she died, but she was born and raised in Sulphur Springs, just down the road. Mm-hmm. And there are very, 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 very few American Indian women that we have stories about where we would be able to say, absolutely, they're suffragists. Part of it is access to records that would still exist. And part of it is having the investment and the promise and the belief that you're going to be able to vote. Until a Citizenship Act was passed in the 1920s, no individuals who were American Indians were able to vote. Members of First Nations didn't have that access. And so you have to think about that in a way. The whole purpose of voting is to have a voice and part of a community. And if you're not defined as part of that community, then believing, let alone investing what very limited time and energy you may have in something that just does not define you is a very big step. And so her step grandfather is considered the founder of Sulphur Springs too. So they have this family thing, and it's just, we could, it's right there from Commerce. And so when I was looking for suffragists, I of course, the book that's coming out looks at, the suffragists and the suffrage organizations, Texas, Minnie Fisher Cunningham. She's very, very important story. And there are suffragists from the 1870s active in Texas all the way through the 19th Amendment and decades later. But I wanted to also find the individuals that we weren't always hearing about, or that we wouldn't have so much access to, and these types of stories. And when I realized that Sophia Alice Callahan was not only born in Sulphur Springs, but wrote pro-suffrage material in her book, it makes her a suffragist. She's publicly advocating suffrage, and I just love that one because it's so Northeast Texas. It's right down the road from Commerce. And neighborhood, right?
That's really neat. It's nice to know it's so close by. I liked what you said earlier. I could see it in your eyes. You're very excited about or passionate about how the movement evolved, especially more recent history. And tell us a little bit about that. What's meaningful about the movement in the later years?
Well, when historians have looked at all of this, the first thing, some of the earliest women's histories are suffrage histories. Some of them are written by suffragists or daughters of suffragists. We're talking 1940s, 1950s for academic published suffrage histories. And even before that, articles on suffrage. Most of the articles on suffrage for Texas were written by Jane McCallum, who was the corresponding secretary for the state association in the last years leading up to 1920. She was also the first woman secretary of state for Texas and the first person to serve as secretary for the state of Texas under two different governors. So you can see how dedicated she is to the political stories. And she was publishing and other suffragists were publishing. And that's really important work, but it's also very limited because they see the suffragists as the people they knew. And who are in their records, and their records are left in libraries, and that's what the early historians had access to. And so it really started probably in the late 80s, early 1990s with research, and then starting being published in the late 1990s. But it's a little bit of an article here or a little bit of a chapter there. But really in the last 10 years, we're seeing the kind of work that's being put out there by historians in academic publications, really focusing on talking about who else were suffragists. What does suffragist mean? What's how broad is it? If someone's a suffragist, what does it mean? It means that they're publicly advocating on behalf of suffrage. It may be 3 other people that they talk to. It may be 300 people they talk to. Could be verbally. It could be in a book. Could be in newspapers are very important. Women writers have been around for a long time. Being able to work in newspapers or be an author was one of the few professions available to women in the late 19th century, but late 1800s, early 1900s. And so if they're maybe not part of an organization, but they're writing about it for a public audience, these are suffragists. And I really find that very exciting, this idea of broadening the story and really going out and trying to find out who they are. And I've teased for a long time about someday writing a piece called If She Walked Like a Suffragist and Talked Like a Suffragist.
I like it.
Because that's kind of how I started to do it 20 years ago. I said, all right, I know what the story basically is. And I know where to find these major, you go through and you go to all the libraries and you go to the universities and you say, okay, I know where the big collections are. I know the collections of letters are, whatever. But I want to find the stories elsewhere too. I want to dig, it's history nerdy. It completely is.
No, I like it. I'm fascinated by it. It's really interesting.
But it's fun. And what makes history so great is it's just human being stories. Mm-hmm. We just love stories. And that's what I was looking for. I was looking for the stories that were different. And because we've been doing that, and because a handful of historians and more are doing it, but also because the public wants it. And they're very vocal about it. They're tired of hearing about just Susan B. Anthony. It's not that there isn't a love for her within society. It's that she doesn't represent everyone. And she wasn't always terribly, equality based within the suffrage movement as well. And people want to see people who looked like us, or even more importantly, whose stories are just interesting to hear. Maud Sampson Williams, other than she was also a teacher and an educator, she and I have very little in common. But her story is so compelling because she never went away. She was, and just as an example for the El Paso one. Mm-hmm. And so in the last few years, as more attention was paid, and I want to point out something to our viewers too. Centennials, the 100th anniversary of things, I really looked into this because I needed to understand what was going on as it was happening, but I needed to talk about it as it was happening. So one of the things that I've been doing in the last couple of years is helping museums and libraries and the National Park Service and the large national historical associations, and also the smaller audiences and groups and local groups really realize how they need to think about this. And I needed to go, okay, why are centennials important? And among other things that we've studied is is anniversaries. And 100-year anniversary gets more attention than anything else. And they've studied this even in places where you're already seeing 300 and 500-year anniversaries, and the 100th-year anniversaries get more attention than anything else. And I think it's because it feels close and far all at the same time.
That's a good way to put it. Close and far at the same time.
It feels like history. It feels a long time ago, and we can learn new things about it. But at the same time, it doesn't feel so long ago that we can't relate to the stories.
Right. That's a very good point.
Mm-hmm. And so this moment is really important. It will never come around again. I mean, it will. The 19th Amendment will turn 150. It'll turn 200. And it's a good moment to say, all right, what have we been doing and what are we not doing? And the public's been really vocal about this. Newspaper editorials, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, blogs, and saying we're tired of it. We're tired of the history we've been given. We're tired of being told that everything was perfect, that everybody got to vote in 1920. When we're being told that's not the case, we don't want to hear that anymore. Tell us the real story. And the real story is that racism existed. It existed inside the suffrage movement. There were racists who were suffragists. There were classists who were suffragists who didn't want people who were hardworking, everyday people, no matter what their racial or ethnic identity was, no matter how long their families had lived in the U.S. or how new they were and how much the U.S. had held promise to their family. They didn't want these hardworking individuals to be able to vote. There are those suffragists, and we need to know that, and we need to talk about it. And we need to ask ourselves why. And it's because voting was so important, and it still is. Voting is power, but it's also a sense of community. And these individuals wanted a control over who they believed were in their voting community. But there was also a lot of individuals who are very much about having every single woman have access to vote. And so we have to tell that story too. And you lose some of that shimmer if you don't realize that not everybody was like that it is a fight. It's not a given that all women were going to be able to have the right to vote. So those are the kinds of things I'm excited about. I'm excited about how much people have been wanting to hear about this. I get emails and phone calls. This is so funny. From little small town newspapers all the time now saying, we want to know about this. And I'm going, I've never done research on your county. I'm so sorry. But I don't want to turn them away. So I'm like, well, go ask this person, or this is what I know. Go, take these names to your local historical society, because it's so exciting to see how excited people are.
It is. I think what you said about voting is powerful, that voting is power and voting is sense of community.
It is.
And I think that combination is really powerful and demonstrates why people feel so strongly about this topic and about this centennial in particular. I'm curious, over the past 20 years, all of the research you've done, digging, what have been the surprises? What has surprised you most?
It surprised me most. That's a good question. I'm not going to say most, if that's okay. Instead, I'm going to say one of the things that surprised me most.
That works.
Is how hard it was sometimes to find information on certain people, very, very famous people, but also how upset sometimes even historians became when you talked about racism in the movement. These are heroes for generations, and people don't accept very quickly. You talking about some of the people they would have considered heroes as being racist. And I think those two things put together actually go together, because if it's very hard to find examples of different groups of suffragists or individuals, it feeds into that, maybe this racism really didn't have a focus, and it didn't cause any harm, because you can't find evidence that there were individuals that it was aimed at who wanted to vote. Once you find that evidence, all of a sudden this racism, it's very harmful, and it proves harm. I'm not the only one, and I need to say this, I'm not the only one who's talked about that either. I don't want to downplay. I'm not going to sit here and name off lists and bibliographies of historians, but I want to make sure that I'm not claiming space that doesn't belong only to me. But I have been one of a handful of historians that have focused on this. And when I'm advising in connection to that, I say, look, you know, we need to tell the full story. The public wants the full story. And so when it comes back to these two things, how hard it is to find those stories. So stories for Texas, very much, usually it's Mexican American women and African American women. It's not that we didn't have German immigrant women in Texas and immigrant women from other portions of the United States. You have to ask, again, going back to that community thing, how many form a community and how much is that community invested in women gaining the right to vote? And so the other thing I wanted so badly to find and never found, that surprised me, but it didn't really, is I wanted somebody that I'd ever done research on just to all of a sudden want to be involved in suffrage, that they weren't exposed to it or argued about it. And it just doesn't work that way. People are drawn to subjects that they feel connect to them. Networks are what bring people in, and human connections bring people in. Yeah. Can I give you a story?
Yes, you may, Jessica.
I love stories about people. I'm sorry.
I do too. I'm with it. I'm with you.
Except not maybe a little more linear. I teach a little more, next step. But there was a woman named Marianna Folsom who I've done a lot of research on and published on her. And when I started working on her, I just found her very interesting. She's traveling around Texas in the 1880s, and this is really early. There are women already here and men who are also advocating for suffrage at least a decade to two before, but she's actually going out, and she's a nationally known suffragist. After I started doing research on her, I realized she was the 5th ordained woman minister in the nation.
Wow.
And I said, you know what? That makes so much sense, though, doesn't it? She's a fabulous speaker. And she'd go, and she always liked to do these local talks. And she also liked rural communities more because she said that people would show up to hear you speak, and the audiences were smaller, and you could really stand around and talk to them. And she would go and she would talk to each individual person, and she would hang out afterwards and she'd talk to people. And I think that right there is such a lesson on how to do outreach with people on any subject in any way, that it's that personal connection. And she talks about, in her writing, she talks about giving talks in these small rural schoolhouses where they give her access to it like after hours in the evening and stuff. And she had to supply her own candles. Or how that they would have gaps in between. This is so Texas, because she originally moved, she was born in Pennsylvania, but she was raised pretty much in Iowa, which is also, you know, fairly windy, but North Texas, right? And she's North Texas and East Texas, and she said the wind would just howl through these gaps in the walls. And I thought, well, gosh, it's 2015 or 2010 when I'm doing research on her. It still does, right? And she rode the railroads, and that's how she got to things. And so, you know, that was one of the things that also surprised me, I think, that you were asking about, is how much that human connection made such a difference during the suffrage. It's one of the reasons Texas is so successful, in my opinion. They were able to organize. There was almost 250. We now have, in 2020, we have 254 counties. Okay. And there was almost 254 counties when the ratification of the 19th Amendment happened. And to just have to organize at that level, because you know that locals are going to be able to be heard and who are going to have their local issues in mind, which is so important. Why would suffrage matter to Hunt County versus maybe Bayada County or Travis County, where Austin is, right? Why is it different in El Paso than it might be in Houston? And those local groups are able to do that and talk about it. And so just that up close personal connection was something that was very interesting too.
I love that, though. The human connection part is critical, and I can see why she loved rural communities living in one. I mean, that sense of connection, it goes back to the sense of community, and the voting is power and community. It makes perfect sense. In learning from all of these men and women in history, part of this movement, what have you learned from them that could help us as we move forward?
Great question. I think the number one thing that you have to learn from this, I don't have to, but it's very much there, is how long change takes, and that it's not going to happen overnight, and it's going to happen in pieces, and that, I mean, we're talking about generations of suffragists in the United States leading up to the ratification, and then generations after, taking that 19th Amendment and taking it further and applying other laws, other U.S. constitutional amendments and other laws will inform the 19th Amendment, and then the 19th Amendment will inform the other laws later, but also getting people to support voter access. And it takes a long time, and we need to commit to that kind of thing. We need to commit to the idea of democracy in a way that isn't going to last for 6 months, that isn't going to last for a day, and we need to make it ours, whatever that is. And this is not about partisanship. This is not about any particular political issue. That change takes time, and during that time, things are going to be good sometimes and things are going to be bad sometimes. And when things are good, you have to keep involved. The other thing is also with that is that when change does happen fast, that it's not going to answer everything. There's no one answer for anything. And so, the 19th Amendment was a huge, huge milestone, but it doesn't answer all the problems. It doesn't fix it. And there's never going to be one fix. And so I think what we can learn is we need to commit ourselves individually, but also as communities and larger society to long-term kind of goals, and realize that if we're going to do that long-term, like anything else, we have to pace ourselves or we'll burn out. And if you have those flash of the pan moments and you burn out, the change never comes. A lot of energy spent, but whatever it is that you're interested in. And one of the ways that we can pace ourselves is to find things that are important to us and that are important to the people who we love, that we're committed to. And if we can do that, then pacing ourselves, staying involved, voting on behalf of these issues, or just voting with them in mind, becomes an easier commitment to make than exhausting ourselves, hoping for something to happen tomorrow that will forever change, because that just doesn't happen that way. Human beings aren't like that. Society's not like that. It just isn't.
You're right, Jessica. I love that idea of tying your endurance and perseverance to those you love, and that giving you the motivation to pursue the hope and the hope of the promise that will come, over time with change. That's beautiful. I love it. How can all of us join together this centennial to celebrate this milestone? How can we be a part of this?
Okay, I'm gonna play with your words. One of the things, and you and I didn't talk about this in advance.
No,
just for our audience, and I can't see you all, but just for our audience. I'm not picking on Kateri, I swear.
I told her to correct me. I said, Jessica, anytime I say something wrong, you have to correct me.
It's not wrong. It's not wrong. It's just something I've been pointing out. One of the things that I've been talking about with folks is, instead of using the term celebrate, let's talk about commemorate, because to a lot of people, the 19th Amendment's also painful history, because it didn't include everyone. And there was so much that had to come after that. And for a long time, those people were erased, and those communities that it didn't include were erased. And so commemorating, so, paying attention and honoring, but not necessarily just woohoo, celebrate. But
I I think that probably
But,
about most holidays, honestly, or most milestones. You're right. There's
you know,
pain
now
in a
that
lot
you
of
mentioned
it.
it,
Mother's Day, all of it. That's
much.
what so
That, you know, part of, I think, is just to go out and find things about it that you're interested in. It's everywhere, you know. And one of the things, the history on this and the information on this, and go find, there are online museum exhibits, there are newspaper articles everywhere. I mean, you Google this right now and you're going to be overwhelmed.
that's why I have you here, so I can just ask you and learn.
But just to kind of get involved in that way and find out what part of this history is interesting. But there's also something else. This is 2020, and this is a voting year. You know, we're coming up on an election. Make sure you vote. Make sure you're registered to vote. And the interesting thing is, people have been saying, and we've talked about this. I mean, I've been doing interviews and, you know, virtual public talks, and before COVID was a part of our lives, in-person public talks for quite a while before on this, and people said, "Oh, isn't it amazing that the 19th Amendment, you know, is the 100th anniversary is coming up during this election year?" It's not amazing. It was planned that way because not the centennial, but the original one. That 100 years ago, you know, elections, presidential elections, and we'll say major math, you know, the vast majority of elections happen every 4 years, and 4 divided by 100, you know, it's a number, it's a full number, and so it's 25 presidential elections ago. And they knew they were coming up with this, and they really wanted to push. And I don't just mean suffragists, because they've been pushing for a long time, but it was also politically helpful for certain congressional members and certain topics to pass the 19th Amendment into law. And there was a push to pass it, you know, as quickly as possible. It takes over a year. After it passes through Congress, then they had to get 36 out of the 40 states to ratify. And you know, so one of the ways we commemorate now is the same way that they were commemorating then, and you know, and they were celebrating at the moment, but commemorating then was vote. I mean, here we have this access, and here we are. And so it's been a really interesting thing to talk also about the, you know, have the election going on during this centennial, because this is a lot of what people are talking about right now. So I think those two things, just go out and find some of the history you find interesting, and then go commemorate the history by using your access to vote, would be, you know, two wonderful things to do this year.
We will do those things. Now, I have a naive question. Last election, I remember women wearing white to go vote that day. What is that?
Okay. So, white in general has the tendency to be a color of remembrance. Yellow as well, blue for different reasons. It depends, and different causes and different groups and different communities will kind of adopt certain colors. And one of the major colors for suffragists to use was white, and it was remembrance, and it was also to push. And it was the remembrance during, you know, prior to the ratification of the passage of the 19th Amendment was very much, remember, we don't have the right to vote. So it's almost even kind of a mourning, being in a strange kind of, you know, moment, and say, look, you know, but it's, and also a lot of women had access to white. And so you could wear all white, and it was very obvious. And part of the reason for that was, you know, linens and things in the summer times. And a lot of the voting rights in Texas, especially, but this is not just Texas, not even by far. We see certain major events happen in the summer. So women would have been doing the sunny way in all white and in linens and in cottons and that kind of thing. But it very much represents a color that was used during the suffrage movement for this push, this representation. And so now when we see individuals dress in all white, if it's voting related and it's women, I mean, there's a lot of things, you know, other than that, but it's very much about this nod, this wink, this look back over the shoulder at the suffrage movement, but also all of the generations of women and all of the work that's gone into before that passage of the 19th Amendment and after the passage of the 19th Amendment that kind of leads up to the modern era. I've also noticed in different contexts and different places around multiple places in the world, actually. So not just in the United States, women showing up to political events dressed as suffragists in the late 19th and early 20th century, and I always find that really interesting, with sashes and the buttons and the hats, and it's so cool to see, like, votes for women, and here they are marching the boots. But the white is very much something that can be adopted now, and we have seen it multiple times from different members of the party, different parties over the last, the most, focused on enormously in the last 10 years, but before that too. And it's kind of that nod.
Okay, that's good. Now I feel better equipped this election day. I may just wear all white also. We'll see. Before we wrap up, what is it that the number one thing you want people to know that they may not know about this commemoration, about this history that you've been working through?
I think this is a bigger history thing too, if that's okay.
Yeah.
As much as we think we know right now, we don't know everything. And because of all the attention that's going into this, and which is, again, so very, very exciting, we're going to have a whole lot more stories that come out. And there's been a lot of involvement in people saying, I'm really interested in this. I want to see this story told. And we need, we really need people to do that. Historians will do the work that historians are going to do. We're going to do what the archives have access to and what resources we have access to and that kind of thing. But there's also often, the audience can have a lot to do with how it's portrayed in public spaces. And so people should be very interested in the history, but they should also, I'm really curious about this, and be vocal about it. Museum exhibits and monuments and statues have all been altered in the last few years because the public refused to accept what they considered an old version of the suffrage story. And the public audience is so important to how we do history, because it's not just for each other as historians. And so those spaces that reach tens and 20 and thousands of people, it's one of the reasons that Texas A&M University of Commerce was the lead sponsor for the suffrage exhibit in the state of Texas at the Bullock Museum in Austin, the State History Museum, was because this kind of history makes it accessible to school children, to just folks who are interested, to tourism, to whatever, because that's where those stories get told. But it's also what makes people curious, makes them want more. And I think that's a very big amount of or very large amount of the culture in A&M Commerce, wanting to provide more and make people curious, and wanting to provide that. And so I think that, what you should do, what I want people to know that they may not know, is that your voice matters on the stories that are told, and how we conceptualize things in the history field, especially in the public spaces that are going to reach the most people. And we need to remember that. And I think people have listened, and I'm so glad to see it.
Me too. And I think staying curious is a critical thing. And you're right. There's, no matter how much we learn and uncover, there's so much more, and lessons to be learned to apply towards the future and right now. So thank you so much, Jessica, for your time today. I feel like I've learned a lot, and I think I have an extra pep in my step as I go to vote this year. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you coming.
Yes. With that, go Lions.
Go Lions.
Always. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you. We're done being live. You did fantastic.